They left the neighborhood the same way they had many times before, with the easy rhythm of a family slipping into routine. The father packed the last tote into the back of the SUV, while the mother double-checked chargers, medicine, and the bag with the kids' pajamas. Their oldest sat in the back seat, glued to a handheld game, while the younger one clutched a stuffed fox with threadbare ears. To their neighbors, it was just another family heading out for a short break. Nothing looked unusual, and no one thought it would be the last time they were seen. The rituals of departure were small but memorable. The father tapped the mailbox before getting in the driver's seat, a habit built from years of forgetting outgoing letters. The mother sent her sister a photo of the kids buckled up, smiling under the caption, "S'mores and stars tonight." A neighbor waved from his driveway and called out that the weekend weather looked perfect. These fleeting exchanges became cemented in memory, replayed over and over later by those who never thought to pay closer attention at the time. There was no sign of stress, no hesitation. The family looked happy. The drive out of town was straightforward. Highway traffic thinned as they moved into the foothills. At 3:41 p.m., a receipt timestamped their stop at a familiar gas station. Security cameras captured the father filling up while the mother walked the children inside for snacks. They returned to the SUV with gummy bears, water, and a newspaper. This simple stop would become an anchor for investigators, one of the last concrete markers of their movements. Beyond that point, everything faded into uncertainty. The road to the cabin wound higher into the mountains. The children argued about the better window seat, their voices muffled by the steady hum of the tires. Clouds gathered in the west, but the weather seemed mild enough. The gravel road to their cabin was quiet, a stretch of forest that swallowed cell service and sound alike. They arrived with daylight left to unpack. The cabin was exactly as they remembered it, wood siding, a small porch, and a neat stack of logs out front. There was nothing to suggest what was coming. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust and pine cleaner. The children ran through their usual routine, claiming bunks and digging through drawers for the flashlight they'd left behind last summer. The father checked the locks, tested the generator, and looked over the first aid kit. The mother texted her sister again at 6:12 p.m. "Here, all good, no service soon." It was a final confirmation that they had arrived safely. The message delivered. The sister replied with a simple heart emoji. She would later revisit that text hundreds of times, searching for something more. Evening fell as they settled into cabin life. The generator rumbled to life, casting a glow across the clearing. The family gathered at the fire ring, the children eager for marshmallows. Their first attempts burned quickly, reduced to blackened sugar, and they laughed as they scraped them off into crackers. The night air carried the crisp edge of altitude. Branches snapped under the weight of acorns, and somewhere far off a lone coyote called into the darkness. Nothing about the night seemed extraordinary. They had done this before. It was comfortable. It was routine. At 2:07 a.m., the cabin's porch light flicked on. The sudden glow washed across the clearing before snapping off again a few seconds later. The father never stirred, but the mother did, just enough to open her eyes and register the faint brightness through the curtains. She thought nothing of it. That light had been sensitive for years. By morning, the detail would fade into the back of her mind. No one could have known it would become part of the case file. Saturday unfolded in the slow rhythm of a family trip. Pancakes sputtered on the uneven griddle, and the kids dragged their feet before the hike to the lake. By mid-morning, they were on the trail, a pair of anglers passing them on their way down. Those men would later confirm the family looked normal, content, nothing out of place. They ate sandwiches by the water, tossed rocks across the surface, and the mother took a picture of her children squinting against the sun. The photo remained on her phone, time-stamped and frozen, one of the last images of their lives before everything stopped making sense. By late afternoon, the sky dimmed. The wind picked up and they decided to head back early. The father checked the fuel in the generator while the mother set out plates for dinner. The children begged for cards after eating, a tradition that allowed the youngest to invent rules no one else understood. The father paused once at the door, staring out into the darkening tree line before shaking it off and returning inside. It was the kind of glance people later remembered, a small sign that something had unsettled him, though he never spoke of it. By nightfall, the family was together in the warm cabin, the door locked, the table set for a meal they never finished. On Sunday evening, when they didn't return home, it wasn't alarming at first. Relatives assumed the trip had simply gone long. By Monday morning, when the children missed school and the father didn't show up for work, concern began to sharpen into dread. Calls to their phones rang unanswered. The SUV wasn't back in the driveway. By that afternoon, relatives reported them missing, and what started as a routine family trip suddenly transformed into the beginning of a haunting mystery that no one could explain. By Tuesday morning, patience had shifted to alarm. Relatives who had expected a late return on Sunday, then tried to reason with themselves through Monday, finally admitted something was wrong. No one had heard from the parents. No texts had gone through, no calls had been returned. The children had missed 2 full days of school, and the father's workplace reported him absent without explanation. It was completely out of character. That morning, the family's relatives filed an official missing persons report, setting into motion a process that would unfold with grim precision. Officers were dispatched first to the family's suburban home. The house was exactly as it should have been for a family planning only a weekend trip. Dishes from Breakfast Friday still sat stacked on the drying rack. The refrigerator held half a gallon of milk with a Saturday expiration date. A neighbor confirmed they had left Friday afternoon, luggage and children in tow, expecting to be back late Sunday. There was no sign they had returned, no forced entry, no disturbances, no vehicles in the driveway. The home was a frozen snapshot of departure, undisturbed by whatever had come next. Investigators immediately checked the family's phones. Cell records showed their last activity came from a stretch of highway that wound into the mountains. One text from the mother, "Here, all good. No service soon," delivered just after 6 p.m. on Saturday. After that, silence. The trail ended near a narrow cluster of towers along the county road. From that point forward, the phones had gone dark. With those pings in hand, search teams were mobilized. Local deputies coordinated with county search and rescue units familiar with the terrain. The area was vast, ridgelines that rose into shadow, logging roads that vanished into overgrowth, streams that cut sharp ravines. Helicopters were deployed to sweep the switchbacks of the mountain highway, cameras trained downward for the glint of metal or skid marks cutting into the soil. Ground teams began checking common pull-offs, hiking trails, and the smaller roads leading toward cabins and campgrounds. Family members waited in a haze of disbelief. Calls poured into the sheriff's office, neighbors volunteering to help, relatives pressing for updates. Detectives interviewed the gas station clerk who remembered the family stopping Friday afternoon. Security footage from the pump confirmed it. Beyond that, the trail was empty. Deputies knocked on doors of nearby cabins, asking if anyone had seen or heard unusual activity over the weekend. Most had not. Those who did recall seeing vehicles couldn't be certain which belonged to which visitor. By Tuesday evening, the search was in full swing. Teams in fluorescent jackets combed ditches with flashlights, probing beneath downed logs and brush piles. K-9 units sniffed along dirt shoulders. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades echoing through valleys, the light from their spot beams cutting across the tree canopy. The only clear fact was that the family had made it into the mountains. Somewhere beyond that, their trail had vanished. Reporters began to pick up the story. A missing family of 4 was more than an isolated case. It was a community's fear laid bare. News vans idled near the sheriff's office. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Was it a car accident off the highway, hidden in brush? Had they wandered into an area without service and become stranded? Or was something more sinister responsible? Detectives held their statements close, offering only that all possibilities remain open. Relatives clung to hope. They imagined mechanical failure, an overturned SUV waiting to be found, injuries, but survivable. They replayed conversations, searched for hidden meanings in the last text message. The mother's sister, who had received it, began to wonder if the words, "no service soon," had been more than casual, if she had meant to warn of something. These doubts settled in quietly, feeding sleepless nights. Meanwhile, the cabin where the family was supposed to be remained unvisited. Deputies debated whether to approach it immediately or wait for ground teams to complete roadside sweeps. By the end of Tuesday, frustration mounted. Hours of helicopter surveillance had revealed no trace of the family's SUV along the main road or the steep ravines that dropped away from its edges. Searchers began to acknowledge what no one wanted to voice. If the vehicle wasn't visible from the air, it might be hidden deeper in the network of trails leading only one place: the cabin. The following morning, search coordinators would shift their focus. Teams were ordered off the highway grid and into the forested back roads. What began as a welfare check had evolved into a full-scale search, with resources pulled from across the county. Volunteers filled the staging area with backpacks, radios, and maps spread across hoods of patrol cars. The mountains were opening their doors to scrutiny, but they offered no clear answers. The family was out there somewhere, and each hour that passed without finding them only sharpened the sense that this was no simple accident. By Tuesday night, as the last helicopter returned to base and darkness sealed the ridges, the mystery had hardened. The family's home was untouched, their phones silent, their SUV still unaccounted for. They had driven into the mountains and never come back. And now, with search crews ready to press deeper toward the cabin, investigators braced themselves for what they might find waiting behind its locked door. By Wednesday morning, the search effort had transformed into a full-scale operation. Dozens of volunteers, deputies, and seasoned rangers gathered at the staging area with maps taped to the sides of patrol trucks. Red grease pencil marks traced likely paths, each arrow representing terrain they hoped would yield a clue. The mountain was vast, covered in thick pine and cedar, broken by gullies and creeks that ran fast even in late summer. It was not a landscape that gave up secrets easily. Searchers understood the stakes: 4 people gone without explanation, their trail dissolving the moment they left the highway. Teams fanned out in methodical lines. The early light barely penetrated the canopy, leaving sections of forest in a permanent dusk. Volunteers marked trees with colored tape as they swept through brush that clung to clothing and slowed every step. The ground rose and fell sharply, gullies dropping without warning into shadow. Dogs pulled at leashes, catching scents that led nowhere, circling back toward campfires long gone cold. For every mile covered, it felt as though the forest had doubled in size, stretching endlessly. Searchers knew they were racing time. If this was an accident, exposure was already a threat. If it was something else, every passing hour lessened the chance of recovery. Crews checked logging cuts, disused mining trails, and ravines hidden from aerial view. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their rotors chopping the stillness. But from the ground, the sound was distant, a reminder that despite the technology, the search came down to human eyes and boots pressing into soil. Midday brought the first flicker of hope. A ranger working a stretch of gravel road noticed tire impressions cutting away from the main track. They were fresh, sharper, less weathered than others in the area. He crouched, studied the tread pattern, and noted how the soil still held moisture in the grooves. He radioed the find to command, voice tight with urgency. A cluster of searchers converged, kneeling one by one to trace the marks. The possibility set hearts racing. Maybe they were finally close. The tracks bent away from the wider path, angling toward the direction of the family's cabin. Spirits lifted. Coordinators rerouted teams, marking the trail on their maps and pressing forward with renewed energy. Radios buzzed with quick updates. For the first time since the family had been reported missing, there was something tangible to follow, something more than silence and speculation. Every step forward carried the weight of expectation. If the SUV had made it this far, then the family had likely reached the cabin. The question was what they would find waiting there. The road narrowed quickly, hemmed in by thick stands of timber. Fallen branches lay scattered, some cleared by the push of tires. Others snapped beneath weight. Searchers walked with increasing caution, noting each detail: scuffed bark, displaced rocks, the faint smell of fuel that seemed to cling to the air. The tracks deepened in softer patches of earth, showing the strain of an uphill climb. Then, almost as suddenly as they had begun, the impressions faded into harder ground. The forest swallowed them without explanation. Still, the direction was clear. The cabin lay beyond. Teams pressed through the narrowing trail until the first searchers broke into a small clearing. There it stood, a structure weathered but solid, shutters drawn tight, its porch shaded by the canopy. For a moment, hope surged. If the family had reached the cabin, maybe they were inside, stranded but alive, waiting for help. The searchers called out, voices cutting across the stillness. But only the echo of the forest answered. They circled the clearing slowly, scanning for the SUV. There was nothing. No vehicle, no tracks continuing beyond the tree line. Just the cabin standing in silence, the ground around it undisturbed. The air felt heavier in that clearing, as if the weight of expectation collapsed all at once. After hours of trudging through brush and false leads, they had finally arrived at the cabin, only to find its presence sharpened the mystery rather than solved it. Volunteers tried doors and windows, but each one was locked tight. No smoke curled from the chimney. The porch was swept clean, without footprints, without signs of struggle or even recent use. It looked like a place prepared for occupancy and then abandoned before anyone had crossed the threshold. Searchers lingered, radios quiet for a moment. As they absorbed the scene, the SUV was gone, the family absent, and the clearing gave no clue as to where they had gone or why. The ranger who first spotted the tracks stood at the edge of the trees, uneasy. He had felt hope rising when he saw those impressions, the sense that finally there was a straight line leading to an answer. But now, looking at the locked cabin and the empty ground around it, that hope gave way to something heavier, a dawning realization that this was no simple rescue. It wasn't just that the family wasn't there. It was that the mountain had allowed them to get this far, only to erase what came next. As dusk closed in and the searchers prepared to regroup, one thought lingered unspoken among them. They had reached the cabin, but instead of relief, they were standing at the edge of a deeper mystery. Whatever answers lay inside, they would have to force their way in to find them. The cabin stood at the center of the clearing, its windows shuttered and its porch swallowed in shadow. Searchers approached slowly, their voices low, each step carrying the weight of anticipation. The family had reached this place, that much seemed certain. The tire tracks that led them here ended abruptly outside the tree line. If the cabin was occupied, it could be the first real breakthrough in the case. But the stillness of the clearing offered no encouragement. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, not wood smoke. No footprints marked the dirt around the porch. One deputy climbed the steps and tried the door. It rattled but held firm. A second searcher tested the latch of a window, but the frame resisted. They moved around the perimeter, checking one opening after another until they circled back to the front porch. The lock wasn't just secure, it was latched from the inside. The implication was immediate and unsettling. Someone had been there last, locking the door behind them, yet there was no one now. They called the family's names, letting the words carry into the woods, then listened. Nothing returned, but the faint rush of wind through the treetops. Radios crackled with updates as search coordinators were briefed. The decision came quickly. They would force entry. No one wanted to damage property without cause, but the stakes were clear. 4 people were missing, and the cabin might hold the answers to where they had gone. With a sharp strike from a deputy's shoulder, the door gave way, splintering near the frame. The moment the lock broke, the smell of a closed-up house drifted into the clearing. Searchers stepped carefully inside, flashlights cutting across the dim interior. What they found brought them to a stunned halt. The family's belongings were everywhere, arranged as if their owners had intended to return within minutes. Coats hung neatly on the wall hooks by the door. Children's backpacks rested in a stack against the entryway, straps tangled together. On the kitchen counter, food lay half-prepared, bread slices out of their bag, condiments open, a knife resting across a plate. The scene was so ordinary that it unsettled the searchers even more. It was the very normalcy of it that clashed with the total absence of the people who should have been living it. The table was set for dinner. 2 plates carried scraps of food, abandoned mid-meal. A child's cup, half full of juice, sat beside them. A deck of cards was spread across the small living room table, as if a game had been interrupted. In the children's bunk room, pajamas were folded on top of blankets, toothbrushes laid out by the sink. It was as though the family had stepped out for a moment and never returned. Searchers moved slowly, documenting each corner with photographs, careful not to disturb anything more than they had to. The sense of intrusion weighed heavily. They weren't just searching a crime scene, they were stepping into the middle of a family's life that had been abruptly cut short. The question hung in the silence. Where did they go, and why had they left everything behind? The lack of disturbance struck investigators immediately. There were no signs of forced entry prior to their own, no overturned furniture, no scattered belongings, nothing indicated violence or struggle. The door had been locked from inside, windows sealed. It was as though the family had vanished willingly, or been compelled to leave without leaving behind evidence of how. Deputies searched for footprints outside, hoping the ground might reveal something the cabin concealed. But the earth around the porch was firm, unmarked. No trail of shoes, no drag marks, no vehicle impressions leaving the site. The SUV was still unaccounted for. How they had arrived and then disappeared without a trace only deepened the confusion. Inside, searchers began noting times on their logs. The food on the counter suggested preparation for an evening meal, yet the perishables had not been touched in days. Milk left on the table had soured. Bread had stiffened in its bag. The timeline aligned with the family's last known contact Saturday night. Everything pointed to them being there that evening, then vanishing sometime after, leaving their possessions untouched. The discovery sent a ripple through the search effort. What had been a mission of recovery now carried the gravity of something more sinister. Relatives were notified, their hopes turning quickly to fear as details emerged. The sheriff's office issued a brief statement to the press. The cabin had been found, but the family was not inside. They offered no further explanation, choosing their words carefully. As night fell, searchers secured the cabin, treating it as an active scene. Photographs captured the unsettling stillness, the coats on the hooks, the half-finished dinner, the backpacks stacked by the wall. Each image seemed to preserve a moment in time, an ordinary evening suspended without resolution. Outside, floodlights cast long beams across the clearing while deputies conferred in low tones. The question no one wanted to voice pressed down heavily. If the family had been inside that cabin days earlier, and if the door was locked from within, how could they have simply vanished without leaving a trace? The forest around them was silent, offering no answer. And as searchers packed up for the night, one reality became undeniable. Whatever had happened to the family, the cabin itself had become the heart of a mystery that now seemed deeper than anyone had imagined. Investigators began their reconstruction with the simplest truth. The family had made it to the cabin. Everything inside confirmed it. Jackets were hung, beds were turned down, and dinner had been prepared. Now the task was to establish what happened between that last verified contact and the moment the cabin fell silent. The forensic team moved deliberately through the rooms, cataloging objects that appeared frozen in time. On the kitchen table, 2 plates sat with remnants of a meal that had never been finished. Bits of bread hardened around the edges, chicken half-eaten and now stiff, a child's plastic fork lying askew across the surface. On the counter, condiments were still uncapped, one jar with its lid left off entirely. Investigators noted the details carefully, each item suggesting an evening interrupted. Near the sink, a pair of candles were found melted halfway down, wax pooled unevenly around their bases. They had been lit, left to burn, and extinguished themselves only when the wax was spent. The wicks were black and curled, time-stamped markers of hours that passed while no one watched them. The evidence suggested that after dinner had begun, no one remained to snuff them out. In the entryway, 2 pairs of children's shoes sat neatly by the door. They were small details, but significant. If the children had gone outside, they likely would have been wearing them. Their absence from the clearing pointed investigators back inside, where the rest of the family's belongings remained. Pajamas folded on the bunk beds, toothbrushes set beside the sink, a stuffed fox with worn ears resting against a pillow. Nothing appeared to be missing. The calendar on the refrigerator carried one notable marking. The weekend of the trip had been circled in red ink. A handwritten note at the corner read, "Cabin, fry to sun." That circle stood out as investigators reviewed it, because the family had been expected back by Sunday night. Everything in their lives, jobs, school, obligations, indicated they had no plans to stay longer. The circle on the calendar became a silent reminder. This trip had an end date, one the family never reached. Detectives contacted the relatives who had last heard from them. The mother's sister showed the final text message, time-stamped 6:12 p.m. Saturday. "Here, all good. No service soon. The message delivered, but nothing followed. Neighbors back home reported receiving brief messages that same evening, one child texting a friend about a game, the father confirming a work schedule for Monday morning. After that, silence. Investigators now had a narrow window. The family was alive and communicating Saturday night, but by Sunday morning, all activity ceased. As they worked through the cabin, one absence spoke louder than the objects left behind. There were no signs of struggle. The locks on doors and windows were intact. The glass was unbroken. Furniture remained where it belonged. No blood, no drag marks, no overturned chairs. Forensic teams ran luminol tests, checked floorboards, and examined walls, but nothing indicated violence. It was as though the family had simply stood up in the middle of their evening and walked out. Yet if they had walked out, why leave everything behind? Investigators pressed the question over and over. There were no missing suitcases, no missing coats, no evidence of hurried packing. Cell phones, wallets, and keys remained inside, untouched. It contradicted every reasonable scenario. Families don't just abandon necessities and vanish into the woods barefoot, without vehicles, in evening cold. Outside, the SUV's absence compounded the confusion. If they had left voluntarily, the vehicle should have been gone. If someone had taken them, the vehicle should have been abandoned nearby. But the clearing offered nothing, no tire impressions leading out, no evidence of departure. It was as if the SUV itself had vanished with them, leaving no trace. Investigators circled back to the cabin's atmosphere. It was deeply unsettling, not because of violence, but because of its normalcy. The table waiting for dinner, the shoes waiting for children, the beds waiting for sleep, all poised for moments that never came. Forensic photographers captured each scene, their images later released to the public in hopes of stirring memory or recognition. But for those who stood in the cabin, the effect was immediate. It felt like walking into a life paused mid-motion. The working theory was simple but chilling. Something had occurred between dinner preparation and bedtime, something powerful enough to draw all 4 family members away at once, without time to gather possessions, without thought of securing their unfinished meal. Detectives debated possibilities: an emergency outside, an intruder who left no sign, or a sudden compulsion none could explain. Each theory fractured under scrutiny, yet no alternative presented itself. The cabin was sealed that evening, marked with evidence tape. Deputies filed out slowly, glancing back at the front door that had been locked from within. They had hoped to find answers there. Instead, they found a haunting absence. What remained was the impression of a night that began like any other, only to dissolve into silence. And as investigators left the clearing, one thought clung to them all. If the family had been pulled from that cabin into the darkness beyond, then the forest itself was holding the next chapter of the mystery. The days that followed brought no relief, only speculation that grew heavier with each fruitless search. The cabin offered fragments of a timeline, but not the ending everyone needed. Investigators gathered in the staging area, circling maps with pens, their conversations turning to possibilities that felt both far-fetched and uncomfortably plausible. Theories multiplied, not because anyone wanted them to, but because the silence of the evidence left no choice. The simplest idea was voiced first. Maybe the family had stepped outside together, perhaps a night walk to look at the stars, or to chase a noise one of the children had heard. If they had left without coats or shoes, it would explain the items by the door. The problem was the trail. Search dogs followed scents into the woods, but only for a short distance. A few hundred yards from the cabin, the trail collapsed. It didn't fade gradually. It ended abruptly, as if the air had swallowed it whole. Handlers repeated the circuit, convinced at first it must be error. But every time, the dogs circled, confused, and lay down. The family's scent ended in a patch of forest with no exit. Another theory gained ground among the relatives: a planned disappearance. Some whispered about debts or hidden troubles, wondering if the family had staged their own vanishing. But investigators checked bank records, employment logs, and credit activity. No withdrawals, no unusual purchases, no sign of preparation. Every account sat dormant. If it was planned with an extraordinary precision that left behind no digital shadow. To those who knew the family well, the suggestion was insulting. They had circled the weekend on their calendar, made school and work arrangements, bought groceries for return. Nothing in their lives hinted at abandonment. The most unsettling theory was an intruder. Could someone have entered the cabin without leaving signs? Could they have compelled the family to leave quietly, without violence, without trace? Deputies walked the interior again and again, looking for overlooked entry points, for fingerprints that didn't belong. Nothing surfaced, no forced locks, no boot prints, no broken glass. The cabin stood untouched, its silence mocking the very idea of intrusion. If a stranger had come, they had left with an impossible cleanliness. Searchers refused to give up. Teams pushed farther into the forest, checking drainage gullies and ravines, the places where a fall might conceal a body or vehicle. The work was exhausting. The terrain shifted from mossy undergrowth to sharp rock outcrops. Creeks cut the land unpredictably, their currents capable of carrying evidence far downstream. Every day ended with more ground covered, but nothing found. The family might as well have walked off the face of the earth. Then came a discovery that both clarified and deepened the mystery. Half a mile down an overgrown road that branched from the main track, a deputy spotted the family's SUV. It sat beneath the shadow of leaning pines, partially obscured by brush. The sight of it drew searchers like a magnet. Radios flared with static as the word spread. They had found the vehicle. Relief and dread arrived in equal measure. The SUV was locked, all four doors sealed, the windows intact. Through the glass, investigators saw the interior, neat, undisturbed. The keys were still inside, resting in the center console. No bags were missing. No obvious damage marked the body of the car. Dust clung to the surface, but the tires were caked with mud from the drive-in, confirming it hadn't been moved since. The family had parked it deliberately and walked away. Searchers scoured the area, desperate for a trail leading out. But the ground told no story. No footprints in the soil, no drag marks, no scraps of fabric. Even with forensic teams combing inch by inch, nothing emerged. It was as if the SUV had been delivered there by unseen hands and abandoned in perfect condition. The silence around it was almost unbearable. The discovery fractured the investigation. Theories tangled against one another. If they had left the SUV voluntarily, why lock the doors and leave the keys? If they had been forced, why wasn't there a sign of struggle nearby? The vehicle should have been the answer that unlocked everything. Instead, it was a new riddle. Reporters swarmed as news of the find reached the public. Headlines framed it as both breakthrough and dead end. Families of the missing clung to hope that the SUV meant the four had walked away alive, perhaps into the wrong hands, perhaps still retrievable. Investigators, however, felt a darker shift. A locked vehicle, personal belongings intact, no footprints leading away. These were the markers of a case slipping beyond the realm of accident. That evening, as the searchers regrouped, the SUV stood taped off under floodlights, its clean lines in eerie contrast to the chaos of the investigation. Deputies walked slow circles around it, whispering theories in low voices, none of them convincing. And when the last radio call was logged that night, one shared feeling lingered among the entire team. They had found the vehicle, but not the family. The forest had returned the car, pristine and mute, while holding on to the four lives it had swallowed. The cabin was sealed after the discovery of the SUV, but investigators knew they had missed something. The first sweep had been fast, focused on confirming presence rather than digging into detail. Now the forensic team returned, determined to peel back every layer. What they found inside shifted the investigation from baffling silence to something darker, subtle traces that suggested another presence had been there, one that did not belong to the missing family. The first clue came near the entryway. On the wooden floorboards, beneath the rack where the family's coat still hung, technicians lifted impressions of muddy prints. At first glance, they could have been tracked in by anyone in the family returning from outside. But when measured against the shoes collected from their home and belongings, none matched. The length was longer, the tread sharper, the pattern inconsistent with the footwear known to be theirs. They were prints from someone else, faint but undeniable. The team moved room by room, re-examining details that had previously seemed insignificant. In the back of the cabin, a window sat open just enough for a hand to slip through. Investigators swore it had been shut during their initial check, but photographs confirmed otherwise. The latch was misaligned, and a thin draft seeped through the gap. Had it been pushed open from the outside? Was it left intentionally, or had someone exited that way? The possibility that an intruder had come and gone undetected began to sink into the room like cold air. Another unsettling detail emerged in the main room, where the family's belongings were neatly arranged. A cabinet that normally held the father's hunting rifle was empty. Relatives later confirmed he had kept the gun at the cabin, but insisted he never brought it out on casual weekend trips. He was responsible with it, cautious to a fault, and would have had no reason to remove it for a short family outing. Its absence gnawed at the investigators. Had he taken it in response to a threat, or had someone else taken it entirely? The most perplexing find came from the children's bedroom. Beneath the bunk beds, wedged between a mattress and the wall, was a crumpled page torn from a notebook. The handwriting was rushed, almost frantic. Jagged lines formed what appeared to be a set of directions or coordinates, though incomplete. Numbers scrawled across the page matched no familiar landmarks. Searchers debated whether it was written by the father, the mother, or someone else entirely. Relatives couldn't identify the handwriting with certainty. The page was bagged and tagged, but even in evidence, it radiated a sense of urgency, as if whoever wrote it had been pressed for time. That night, a search team was dispatched to follow the directions as best they could. The trail led them through steep terrain, into gullies where brush grew thick and light struggled to penetrate. For hours, they hacked through undergrowth, GPS devices flickering with weak signals as they tried to make sense of the coordinates. Each step carried hope that the scribbles would reveal something, a campsite, an abandoned structure, perhaps even the missing family themselves. But when they reached the spot indicated, there was nothing, just dense forest, trees stacked endlessly in every direction. The place was silent, indistinguishable from miles of wilderness around it. The discovery of these clues unsettled both investigators and relatives. For the family, each detail only deepened the dread. Muddy prints from a stranger, an open window, a missing rifle. None of it fit the picture of a safe weekend retreat. For detectives, the evidence complicated what had already seemed impossible. If an intruder had been present, how had they entered and exited without leaving a clearer trace? If the father had taken the rifle himself, why had it never been found in the SUV or nearby woods? And who had written the frantic note that now sat in an evidence locker under lock and key? Theories shifted again. Some investigators leaned toward foul play, convinced the cabin had been breached and the family forced out. Others wondered if paranoia had overtaken the father, driving him to arm himself and scribble confusing directions before leading his family into the woods. But neither explanation held without more. The SUV had been abandoned, the cabin sealed, and the forest yielded nothing. By the end of the sweep, one thing was clear. The cabin was no longer just a backdrop. It was the center of a puzzle that refused to come together. Each new clue promised direction, only to collapse into silence. And as searchers filed out that evening, casting one last look at the window ajar and the hook still heavy with coats, the sense lingered that someone else had been there in that cabin. Someone whose presence was stamped into the floorboards, but whose identity remained as hidden as the family themselves. As the investigation dragged on without answers, whispers began to ripple through the community. At first they were quiet, hushed retellings of things locals had always known but rarely discussed. The mountain, they said, had a history. Old mine shafts still dotted the ridges, forgotten openings that swallowed light and echoed with unseen depths. Over the years, hikers had reported stumbling on them, black holes in the earth surrounded by rusted timbers and half-collapsed stone. Strangers were often spotted camping without permits in the same forests, men who came and went without leaving names, their fires burning late into the night along logging roads. And there were the sounds. Hunters told of unsettling noises that drifted through the timber, mechanical hums that had no source, voices carried when no one was near. To some, these details were superstition. But now, with an entire family missing, they resurfaced like embers fanned back to life. Investigators leaned into the rumors, desperate for leads. Deputies traced reports of a drifter who had been seen walking the mountain highway the same weekend the family disappeared. Witnesses described him as tall, unshaven, carrying a pack too heavy for a short hike. A composite sketch circulated, and a small manhunt began in the surrounding towns. But when they tracked him down 2 counties away, he had an alibi that held. He'd been picked up by a truck driver the night the family vanished and documented in a diner's security footage. He was quickly cleared, but suspicion had already spread, attaching itself to anyone who didn't seem to belong. Other suspects surfaced. A group of squatters had been rumored to live in a cluster of abandoned cabins off a logging spur. Deputies hiked in to find them, only to discover rotting structures filled with animal nests and rusted cans, no signs of human habitation for years. A parolee in a nearby town was briefly questioned, but his movements didn't overlap with the timeline. Each lead fizzled into nothing, but each failed pursuit chipped away at morale. Every door investigators opened seemed to reveal only more emptiness. Searchers themselves began to admit to feelings they hadn't shared at first. Several volunteers confessed that while combing the woods near the cabin, they felt watched. Not once, not fleetingly, but in a way that carried through entire shifts. The sensation was specific, they said, as though eyes tracked them just beyond sight. Radios crackled with interference at odd intervals. Words were lost mid-sentence, replies broken by static, even when teams were well within range of one another. Technicians tested equipment, but found no explanation. Batteries drained faster than expected. Compasses spun briefly before steadying. Searchers shook it off in front of others, but privately it unsettled them deeply. By the second week, the mood in town had shifted entirely. What had begun as a hopeful rescue effort now carried the weight of dread. Parents watched their children more closely, neighbors double-checked locks, and even routine trips into the mountains dwindled. The family's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy anymore. It was something that felt contagious, a reminder that the forest could still take without giving back. Rumors layered themselves on top of one another, each one darker than the last. Investigators tried to cut through the noise, focusing on forensics and timelines, but even they felt the pressure mounting. They had the cabin with its missing rifle and mysterious footprints, the SUV abandoned without explanation, and a note scribbled with numbers that led nowhere. Beyond that, there was nothing. Every rational path closed too soon. Every theory required a leap no evidence could support. The mountain, it seemed, resisted conclusion. Community meetings turned tense. Some residents accused law enforcement of hiding details. Others insisted they knew who was responsible, pointing fingers at reclusive neighbors, at seasonal workers, at anyone who didn't attend church on Sundays. Investigators had to remind them that accusations without proof destroyed lives, but fear rarely listened to reason. Tension hardened into paranoia, the kind that cracked open old grievances and made people look twice at familiar faces. For the search teams, the forest had changed. The first days had been filled with determination, driven by the belief that somewhere out there, the family waited to be found. Now the woods felt hostile, oppressive. Every snapping branch put nerves on edge. Every unexplained rustle deepened the silence that followed. The dogs still caught scents that circled back on themselves. Trails led nowhere, stopping cold in open ground. The mountain seemed to erase itself as quickly as it was mapped. Late one evening, a seasoned ranger stood with his team outside the taped cabin and admitted aloud what many had only thought. It feels like they were here one moment and gone the next, like the mountain just took them. It wasn't an official theory, and it wouldn't go in any report, but the words carried, repeated by volunteers and whispered later in kitchens across town. By then, the case was no longer just an investigation, it was a shadow over the entire community. Facts had stalled, but the fear moved forward, gaining momentum of its own. The family had vanished into thin air, and every day that passed without their return made the silence surrounding their absence feel less like coincidence, and more like something deliberate, something the mountain wasn't willing to give back. Weeks passed, and the case had grown colder despite relentless searches. The SUV remained a dead end, the footprints inconclusive, the note meaningless without context. The forest had yielded nothing more than silence. Investigators, pressured by families and the growing unease in town, decided to return to the one place that seemed to hold more questions than answers, the cabin itself. This time, it would no longer be treated as just a waypoint. It was officially sealed as an evidence site, every inch to be combed with the precision usually reserved for homicide scenes. Deputies arrived with rolls of yellow tape and evidence markers, closing off the clearing. Forensic specialists moved inside, their focus sharper than before. The cabin had already been swept twice, but investigators admitted privately that exhaustion and the urgency of those first days may have left blind spots. Now, with weeks of unanswered questions weighing on them, they approached the space differently, determined to treat it as though it had been a crime scene from the very beginning. They moved room by room, lifting rugs, prying open floorboards, dismantling cabinets. Dust filled the air as storage spaces long undisturbed were exposed. It was in the children's bedroom, small, with its bunk beds pressed against one wall, that a deputy felt unevenness beneath his boots. A rug lay near the center of the floor, patterned with cartoon animals, faded from years of use. When he peeled it back, he found a square outline cut into the wood, a trap door recessed and unnoticed until now. The latch was stiff but gave way after several attempts. When the door swung open, a stale draft rose from the dark space below. Flashlights swept across a shallow cavity, a storage compartment dug beneath the foundation. It was cramped, barely large enough for a child to crouch in. Dust clung to the beams and cobwebs shivered in the sudden light. At first glance, it looked empty. But then one of the technicians noticed something in the far corner. It was a small toy, a stuffed animal, worn at the seams, a rabbit, its ears bent and one button eye hanging loose. It lay on its side, as if dropped or discarded in a hurry. One paw was twisted tight around itself, clutched against the floor. No other belongings were found, no food, no bedding, no signs of long-term use. Just that single toy sitting in the corner of a hollow space no one knew existed. The discovery unsettled everyone present. The immediate question was why it was there at all. Had one of the children used the space to play? Had the family known about the trapdoor and treated it as storage? Or was it something more sinister? Had they hidden inside it, crouched together in fear, until they were forced out? Photographs were taken, the toy bagged as evidence. Relatives later confirmed the stuffed rabbit belonged to the youngest child, who had been inseparable from it. They insisted she would never willingly part with it. The fact it was left behind, out of sight in a hidden space, carried implications no one wanted to voice. Speculation erupted immediately. Some investigators suggested the family may have hidden in the storage space after sensing an intruder. Perhaps they climbed down with the toy, hoping to remain unseen before being discovered or lured out. Others doubted the theory. The space was too small to fit 4 people, and there were no disturbances suggesting recent occupancy. It felt staged, but staged by whom no one could say. The town, already steeped in fear, seized on the discovery. Rumors spread quickly. People whispered that the cabin held secrets the family had only just discovered, that the trapdoor was never meant to be found. Others said the toy was a sign the children had been forced out, leaving behind the only thing they wouldn't willingly abandon. Each interpretation grew darker, none supported by proof. For investigators, the trapdoor presented more questions than answers. It explained nothing about the SUV, nothing about the footprints, nothing about the note with coordinates. But it did add a new thread, a hidden space that connected directly to the children, a detail intimate enough to feel personal. The idea that someone else might have known about it gnawed at the team. When the cabin was sealed again that evening, deputies stepped out into the cooling air of the clearing with heavy expressions. They had found something significant but not clarifying. The toy was a symbol, not an explanation. Its presence deepened the mystery rather than solved it. And as word of the discovery filtered back to town, one question began to dominate every conversation, whispered late at night in kitchens and over fences. If the family had hidden there, what or who had driven them into the dark? Years passed, and the search for the missing family shifted from an urgent rescue mission into a haunting absence that refused to fade. Every season brought new attempts. Search parties combing the ridges in spring, cadaver dogs sweeping gullies in the summer, divers lowering into icy creeks as autumn closed in. Each effort ended the same way, with silence. No remains, no clothing, no scraps of evidence to prove what had become of them. The forest gave back nothing. For relatives, time only deepened the wound. Birthdays and anniversaries came and went without answers. The children's classmates grew older, graduated, left town, while their names remained frozen in news clippings and missing person posters. The parents' workplaces quietly replaced them, their desks cleared, their files reassigned. Life moved forward everywhere but in the homes of those who loved them, where it felt like the family was still out there somewhere, suspended in the same weekend trip they never returned from. Investigators cycled through theories, each one grasping at fragments that never fit together. Some believed in abduction, that a stranger, or perhaps someone they knew, had entered the cabin that night and forced them out. But if that were true, why leave no trace? Why abandon the SUV half a mile away, locked with the keys inside as though waiting to be retrieved? Others insisted it must have been an accident. Maybe they had ventured into the woods at night, become lost, and succumbed to exposure. Yet the sheer number of searchers, dogs, and aircraft that covered the area in those early days made it almost impossible to believe 4 bodies could remain hidden indefinitely. As the years wore on, darker possibilities took root. Some pointed to the open window and muddy prints in the cabin, arguing the family had been stalked. Others latched onto the crumpled note, suggesting the directions were an attempt to communicate something before they vanished. A few spoke of the mountains themselves, of the way people had gone missing there before, swallowed by mines, caves, or something stranger. To them, the family's disappearance was less a crime than a reminder that the wilderness could still take without giving back. The case remained active, but hope thinned. Detectives rotated off the file, leaving behind stacks of reports, photographs of the dinner table set but unfinished, the coats on their hooks, the backpacks still waiting by the door. New eyes would review the evidence only to arrive at the same impasse. Nothing connected. Each clue, the locked cabin door, the half-burned candles, the abandoned SUV, was unsettling on its own, but together they refused to build a coherent story. For the relatives, the images became unbearable. A dinner table frozen mid-meal, a toy left hidden in a trapdoor beneath the floor, a rifle missing, though no one could say by whom. These weren't just details of an investigation. They were the only remnants of a family whose lives had been interrupted in the most ordinary of moments. The cruelty lay not just in their disappearance, but in the silence that followed. The cabin still stands, weathered now, the wood graying under years of storms. It has been visited countless times by investigators, journalists, and curiosity seekers, each of them drawn to the idea that maybe they'll notice something overlooked. None have. The rooms remain exactly as they were the night the family disappeared, every object a relic of that vanished evening. What waits behind the cabin door is not an answer, but the absence itself, an emptiness preserved so perfectly it feels staged, as if time itself had stopped. The town carries the memory like a scar. Conversations still pause when the case is mentioned, eyes drifting toward the ridges that loom beyond the streets. People wonder aloud if the family is buried there, hidden in a shaft or ravine, or if they were taken somewhere far beyond the forest. No one knows, and perhaps no one ever will. What is left are fragments: a locked door with no one inside, a dinner that was never finished, a car left waiting, a toy abandoned in a secret space. Each piece raises more questions than it answers. Years of searching have done nothing to loosen their hold. The mystery has resisted closure with a kind of stubborn finality. And so the case endures, unsolved. The family who left for a simple weekend getaway never came back, and the mountain has kept whatever secret it holds. For investigators, for relatives, and for the community, what remains is not evidence of what happened, but the chilling stillness of what did not, their return.